welcome again to the show. My guest today is Gwynne Dyer, veteran journalist, author, and a man who's studied, researched, written about war for many years. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Leslie.
In your book titled War, that first chapter is called The Nature of the Beast. What does it all boil down to? What is the nature of the beast?
It's a thing we do. It's a functional thing, or was until recently. Groups that were good at it prospered at the expense of groups that were less good at it. We didn't invent it, we inherited it from pre-human ancestors, I'm sure, perhaps even pre-primate ancestors. It's not all that uncommon. We used to think other animals didn't do this sort of stuff. Of course they do if they're predators and they live in groups. And as we have become more powerful, living in bigger groups, access to more impressive technologies, so has war become more impressive, though actually we're only now getting back to the scale of casualties we inflicted on each other when we were hunter-gatherers. I mean, it's not a straight line progression.
No. It doesn't seem that there's ever some next generation that comes along and says, well, that's it. We're going to end this institution entirely. Of course, people say it. I take that back. They say it, but it doesn't happen.
No, they actually only began saying it a very short time ago. I mean, they didn't begin saying it until war got out of hand, which for the purposes of our society was about 60 years ago. Really, seriously out of hand, because the two world wars were kind of warning signals that this is getting to be a bit dangerous, what you're doing. You're killing an awful lot of people, but we were actually only probably getting back up to we weren't even back up to the casualty tolls that hunter-gatherer societies bear. If you look at the Second World War, yes, the casualties have crept up a lot. 10% of every country from Germany east in Europe was killed in the 10% of the population. Germany, Poland, Russia. That's a lot in only 6 years. But actually that's about the level that you would expect if you were a hunter-gatherer band.
Same percentage.
Same percentage, about 30% 30% of the adult males in any given generation killed in war. But now you're approaching totality. By the end of the Second World War, you got dropping nuclear weapons on cities. And the message here is clear. If you go back and do this one more time, all the great powers go to war again, and this time they start with nuclear weapons. You're going to kill 50 million people an hour. All your children will die.
And that's unacceptable.
That's unacceptable. So at that point, it starts earlier. It starts with the First World War, really. But at that point, a lot of people come to the conclusion, we got to change this. So how long have we been trying? 100 years if you count it from just before the First World War. 60 years in a serious way is how long we've been trying. Don't be surprised if you're not there yet.
So we have a chance.
Oh, I think so.
For just beginning that. Now, looking at that broad sweep of history, it seems relatively easy to come up with a means of inciting men to go to war. Has that changed dramatically over all these years, or is it pretty much the same?
Well, no, because part of what's ingrained in us, I suspect, is loyalties to our own group, suspicion of outside groups, and an ability to mobilize emotions rapidly when it is about outside groups. The groups in question now have hundreds of millions in some cases, not dozens, but the mechanisms are the same. I mean, we are who we are. We can redirect, but we cannot change our constitution. And one of the classic psychological things we know about human psychology is in-group, out-group stuff.
That's all it takes. It seems like an awfully simple formula, doesn't it? It seems to be working in the United States and elsewhere.
It works. Well, it works. I mean, it doesn't always work because we are also thinking human beings and we have access to various sources of information if we choose to take advantage of that access. It's harder to lie to us if we are actually paying attention than it used to be, because there are alternative sources of information available. But most people are lazy. Most people don't give their full attention to affairs beyond their own lives.
And so they allowed it to happen. Now, you talk about soldiers and fighting. You were interested in that part of their fear. I mean, clearly they experience this mortal fear. They admit to it on questionnaires in various world wars in recent times. What are the tactics used by leaders to overcome that most basic notion of self-preservation and go charging out into whatever battle?
Well, actually, that's relatively easy. All you have to do is create the kind of bonds that would exist automatically in a small group in the past because they knew each other. They were probably related. You know, the city militia of a Sumerian, city-state. Or in a mass society like our own, you just go, push on the small group dynamic stuff, create these small group loyalties, bonds between particularly males who know each other, have been told that they must depend upon each other, push them through some rather harrowing experiences, but controlled levels of danger, and you build that small group identity. After that, it's not hard to get people to be brave because they don't want to appear cowardly in the eyes of those whose opinions they value, and that's what the small group is about. So it's not hard to get them to be brave. It's actually harder in a way to get them to kill. Because you're I'm sure familiar with the story, but the U.S. Army discovered at the end of the Second World War that most of the soldiers weren't killing anybody. They didn't run away, but they either didn't fire, they aimed high deliberately. 85% of them did everything they possibly could to avoid killing the enemy because at the last moment they realized they didn't really want to kill people.
Yes.
Now you can deal with that, but it takes much more specific work. I mean, once the armies realized that, of course, they immediately went at it hammer and tongs. And it was universal. I assume that the U.S. Army didn't win all its battles, but it didn't lose all its battles. And if the Germans or the Japanese hadn't been experiencing the same inhibitions, they would have lost all their battles.
Are there notable peoples somewhere on the planet that have absolutely no compulsion for war? The exceptions to this rule of the beast here we're talking about.
I don't know of any societies that over the long term have not had serious experiences of warfare. I mean, you can find, the Swiss now have had no wars at all since a civil war in the early 19th century. But the Swiss were, you may recall, for several centuries, the mercenaries of all Europe, the most warlike population of all, though they were very poor and rented their soldiers out to other people. I mean, same with the Swedes, The Swedes are pretty peaceful now, but actually, the Swedish armies all over Russia and Scandinavia, Gustavus Adolphus in the middle of Germany, down to the 1700s, the Swedes were seriously dangerous. Now, do societies go the other way? Do they go from being peaceful to warlike, because this is all warlike to peaceful, and clearly has something to do with rising prosperity? I can't think of so many that go from peaceful to warlike, which is an encouraging thought. I mean, Canada's gone from a rather militaristic nation that quite cheerfully sent its soldiers off to die in imperial wars in other continents, to a country which doesn't do that.
In a relatively short amount of time.
In a relatively short amount of time, we've gone from a militaristic nation to a rather pacifistic one. And I can think of a number of examples of that. The other way around, I can't. So there's a bit of hope for you.
Good, thank you. I need that optimism every once in a while. In your book, Future Tense, you suggest that this terrorist issue is kind of a blip on the screen of history. It's not really a big problem. Maybe you could explain that.
I read this every day. The great problem, the great fear of our time is terrorism. What? Are you joking? There hasn't been an single individual killed by terrorists in North America in over 3 years now, since 9/11. That was one big, horrible event,
Yes.
As many Americans died in September 2001 from terrorism as died in traffic accidents. So that's pretty serious, although, in fact, they die in traffic accidents every month at that rate. But, nobody's been killed by terrorists in North America. over 3 years. In the whole world, the terrorists whom we are encouraged to worry about, because we're not in a war against terrorists, you understand? If we are in any kind of war, it's against terrorists who attack Americans, not against ETA, not against the IRA, the Tamil Tigers, and so on, but against the Islamist terrorists. Well, they around the planet have killed less than 1,000 people. That counts the Bali bombing, the Madrid bomb, the bombs in Istanbul, the most recently Jakarta, all of them. Well, that's less than a person a day being killed by these guys. Now tell me that this is the world's most dangerous threat.
I mean, global warming could possibly be much worse than
Yes,
that.
or AIDS,
it's kind of slow, so
or
it
even
doesn't
a
have the
serious
drama.
outbreak of hangnail. I mean, this is the most preposterous. Among the stupid things that we allow people to tell us every day and don't really get up and shout them down, this has got to lead.
Is that just because our focus in our life and our history is just this little chunk right here? All we can see is what happened last week, last year, and a couple of years in each direction?
Well, there's that. There's the fact that people have no standard of comparison. First of all, people don't know statistics. They don't understand how statistics work. They don't understand that, there are big risks in your life and there are small risks. And then there are infinitesimally tiny risks, and terrorism's one of those.
My guest today is Gwynne Dyer. We're going to take a short break and be back with him right after this.
This series is brought to you as a public service by Mount St. Vincent University.
And welcome back to the show. My guest today is Gwynne Dyer. Gwynne, you seem to suggest in your future tense book that this presence of an American conservative, militant president is really a good thing for those extremists on the other side.
Sure. I mean, he does what they want. The point of 9/11, terrorists do have strategies. They do have goals. They're not driven by hatred. They don't do this because they hate America's freedoms, as Mr. Bush would have us believe. They don't give a damn one way or the other about America's freedoms. They have goals, and the goal has been for 25 years to come to power, but above all in the Arab countries. They say the Muslim countries, and they talk in the name of Islam, but they're almost all Arabs. The Islamists, bin Laden's lot, come to power in the Arab countries. And there have been Islamist underground revolutionary movements using terrorist tactics in all the big Arab countries since the late 70s, in Saudi Arabia, Syria, Egypt, Algeria, you name it. They have not come to power anywhere even once. Why not? Because they can't get 1 million people out in the street. They're never going to get a military coup going. The most secular forces in all of these countries are the armies, so they can't expect them to help. The only other way to carry out a revolution is in the streets, and that requires a lot of people willing to get out and risk their lives to bring you to power. Doesn't happen. Arabs aren't fools. They don't fall for this stuff in sufficiently large numbers to risk their lives to bring down, say, President Mubarak, if what you get instead is, Zawahiri bin Laden's the deputy, another guy with, staring eyes and a fanatical attitude who's going to ruin your life a different way. No, thank you, we'll just stay home. So bin Laden actually creates Al-Qaeda and attacks the United States, which is what it is designed to do from the start, essentially in order to break the stalemate, long bloody stalemate, in the Arab world by getting the United States to invade Muslim countries, starting with Afghanistan, which he knew would get invaded, that's where he was, and expecting that those invasions would end up in long bloody guerrilla wars generating the kind of images of Muslim children blown apart by American cluster bombs, Muslims being rounded up by Americans in mass arrests, abusive prisoners, all the stuff that actually did happen in Afghanistan when the Russians invaded from 79 to 89, and this is a war that bin Laden fought in, so the Russians had been suckered into invading Afghanistan actually by the Americans who launched an insurgency there to bring them in. Now it's America's turn to get suckered into invading Afghanistan, and then we'll get the propaganda we need that outrage Muslims everywhere and drive them into the arms of the extremists, and maybe we can finally make these revolutions happen in the Arab world at last. That's the strategy behind 9/11. And of course, Bush effectively had to invade Afghanistan after 9/11.
Yes.
The American public knew where bin Laden was living, but within a week or so they knew the whole backstory. Go get him, George. And, you know, if Al Gore had been president, he'd have had to invade Afghanistan after 9/11. Okay. In that sense, bin Laden got what he wanted, but the Americans actually played it very cleverly in Afghanistan. They never put a lot of troops on the ground. They used local proxies, the rebel groups, the Northern Alliance, the minority ethnic groups. They supplied them with weapons. They bombed in front of them, very precise bombing. They put very few Americans on the ground, and so they overthrew the regime, smashed up the terrorist camps, drove them into...
Build up the American
Yeah.
confidence that they could do this again in the next country.
Well, that may be so too, but I don't think, I mean, because Afghanistan wasn't part of the neoconservative project. It was they were surprised by 9/11 as everybody else. I don't believe the conspiracy stories. And they had to deal with Afghanistan first.
Right.
That was what the American public demanded. And everybody else was quite happy to let them do it. In fact, we were happy to send troops to help. You know, the UN didn't have a problem with this. Canada sent troops.
Yes.
France sent troops. Germany sent troops. Even the Russians offered to send troops, so we thought that was tactless. And, you know, it worked fine, and it didn't give bin Laden what he wanted. I mean, America did invade, which he wanted, but it didn't result in the kind of horror show going over a long period of time, generating the images that would alienate Muslims and drive them into the extremist camp. Then a year and a half later, Mr. Bush gives him a free kick. He invades Iraq. And that does generate all of those images. But it wasn't about terrorism. It was a whole separate agenda, an American agenda, which was sort of smuggled in under cover of the war on terror, but had nothing to do with it. Yeah.
What's your best case scenario for the end of hostilities in Iraq that puts the world in better footing?
Get the American troops out yesterday. I mean, don't give me this argument that you got to stay there now that you started because you got to finish the job. You can't finish the job with American troops. As long as they're there, the resistance is going to keep going. I mean, Iraqis don't believe or trust the Americans. They will not accept a government imposed by the Americans, and there will be no stability in that country so long as the Americans are there. Now, I don't guarantee there will be stability if the Americans leave, but that's at least giving them a chance.
Yeah. Suppose tomorrow, through some miracle, Iraq was settled and the threat of Islamic terrorists just evaporates. Do American hawks move on to the next rogue state, the next evil empire? Or do people actually kind of throw up their hands and say, hey, everything's okay now?
Well, it would get to be a harder sell. I mean, the Hawks would keep trying. But the Hawks, you see, I mean, the Hawks had designated Iraq as the first target by 1998, if we mean by Hawks the neoconservatives. They were publicly demanding the invasion of Iraq by 1998. If, you know, all that turns out fine and the terrorists disappear, ching, you know, will they give up their ambition, which is essentially global hegemony, Pax Americana? No, they won't. But they'll have a hell of a lot harder time selling it. In fact, they'd never even have sold the invasion of Iraq without 9/11. Americans aren't keen on foreign wars. It's very hard to persuade them to invade a country 12,000 miles away that isn't doing anything. You know, I mean, they were going to try. I mean, I know the neocons under Mr. Bush were going to try to drum up an invasion of Iraq, but they weren't likely to make it in terms of persuading American public opinion to support that kind of a war, unless something like 9/11 had happened.
It has to come close to home. It has to be.
Yeah, that's
pretty
right.
much on the
And that's
other side.
why you have all these conspiracy theories about 9/11, which I say I don't believe. But you can see why they exist, because it did so much suit the neocons' book
Right.
that this should
Yeah, it was
happen.
a textbook case.
Yeah.
Are you ever nostalgic for the Cold War?
No, never. No, come on. The Cold War was a confrontation in which 10,000 nuclear weapons could fall out of the sky in a single day if somebody got something seriously wrong, and destroy 5,000 years of civilization.
So you don't believe that, in effect, the Cold War worked? The both sides having the massive weapons actually kept the peace and
We
sustained the
came
peace?
very close several times. I mean, that's insane. You know, this nostalgia. The nostalgia for the Cold War predominantly prevails in the United States because that's when, of course, there was a kind of Pax Americana, at least in the West, in which the United States did have a final say in everything. We gave it the final say because we were scared of the Soviets. They didn't even really ask for that Pax Americana. They got handed it in 1945 or 1949 when we created NATO, because everybody in the West was so scared. And yes, these guys miss it. They want it back.
You're kind of suggesting in your book, though, in future tense, that we're in a relatively peaceful phase of history, that we may get back to this global realignment of two massive powers or something. Is that true?
Well, that's the worry, you see. I mean, I don't know if this is a holiday from history or a new phase of history, but it sure is beginning to look like it's a holiday, and holidays end. The 15 years we've just come through are years where no great power fears any other great power or sees any other great power as an enemy. Now that's pretty rare in history. In fact, it may be unprecedented. And exactly what you need in a world beset with not just nuclear weapons, but a number of other problems which would otherwise, in normal circumstances, lead to catastrophic wars, like the kind of stresses that are going to be put on the system as climate change really starts to bite, like the fact that you've got new great powers growing up and demanding a place in the system. The Chinese first, then the Indians, really are going to be among the leading 3 or 4 powers. And, you know, do we peacefully move aside and make room for them, or do we do what we did before the First World War when Germany was in the same position, freeze it out, force it to fight its way in? Certainly all the stuff that the United States is doing now is trying to freeze it out and make it fight its way in under the present administration. I mean, I really do think that American strategy under the present lot is a long-term strategy, not an unintelligent one, though I think a foredoomed one, in which they understand that 20 or 30 years down the road, unless they do something pretty drastic, they will no longer be the sole superpower. They will be one among the many leading powers, okay?
Yes.
But no more than that.
And that's inevitable.
And that's anathema, that's unacceptable. And so you've got to do something now to slow this slide. And I think that's what the sort of takeover bid, the Pax Americana, flagship of which is the invasion of Iraq, is about. And even if I'm wrong, I am wrong together with the governments of China, Russia, Germany, and France, who all see it that way.
Okay, well, you're in good company there. We're going to take one other short break, and we'll be back with Gwynne Dyer right after this.
If you'd like more information about this program or any of the courses we offer at a distance, call us or visit our website. We welcome your comments.
Welcome back to the show. My guest is Gwynne Dyer. Bringing an end to war, the great thing the folk singers sing about here, seems like to require a monumental redefinition of nationhood. Will that happen in my children's lifetime?
Well, how old are your children? I don't know.
They're
It'll
20.
be a while.
Okay.
It'll be, no, you need younger ones probably.
Yeah.
But I mean, we're making progress. There's no question about it. Nationhood isn't the same absolute value it used to be for Canadians or for anybody else. I mean, you know, in the developing world, they're a bit further down the curve, but they're getting there too. Yeah, mentalities are changing. There is hope.
Can we end up with kind of a quirky but semi-workable European Union for all nations?
Why not? I mean, it's better than a world government. I don't think we need a 4th level of government.
Yes.
But we do need a context to cooperate within.
Gwynne Dyer, thanks for coming on the show.
You're welcome.
And thanks for watching. I'm Leslie Choice. I'll see you next time.